There are currently around 1.2 billion people living in fragile states. In fact, these states make up almost a quarter of the world's countries. And fragile states tend to be characterized by weak capacity, authority, legitimacy of the state, poor relationship between state and society, and poor quality of governance. What we see is fragile states are the states that are lagging behind most in terms of development. They're the ones that are most off track in terms of meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And in fact, it's predicted that by 2030, more than half of the world's poorest people are going to be living in fragile states. In an increasingly globalized world, we can expect to see global and local drivers of fragility and interacting in ever more potent ways. We see this already in a number of regions, from the Sahel, for example, to Central America. And this means that those concerned about fragility, those seeking to address fragility, need to think not just about local challenges and supporting local actors and institutions, but also addressing at multilateral level the global drivers which affect and fuel fragility across the world. These global drivers are very varied. They range across different policy areas. For example, economic drivers. We know that fragile states are often weakly or negatively incorporated into the global economy. Also natural resources. That fragility is often exacerbated by mismanagement of natural resources or conflict over natural resources. Likewise, population is going to be an increasingly big challenge for many fragile regions, particularly in Africa and South Asia, where populations are set to grow. We're going to see large youth populations for which there is not sufficient economic opportunities. Likewise, climate change. We know that many fragile states are in regions where they're likely to be particularly affected by climate change, from Bangladesh to West Africa, and that these countries often lack the resources and the capacity to adapt and respond. And finally, transnational organised crime. In an increasingly globalised world, international criminal networks have an ever greater outreach, and fragile states are particularly vulnerable to their negative effects. For example, if we look at the international drugs trade, fragile states are often both production and transit points for international criminal networks. In coming years, quite a number of fragile and conflict-affected states are expected to build stronger institutions, to grow economically, and to exit from fragility. But there will be a number of states that are left behind. And these can fall perhaps into two types which should be of most interest to us and we should be most concerned about. On one hand, there are large middle-income fragile countries like Nigeria, Sudan, Pakistan, for example, which pose a significant risk in terms of insecurity, not just to their region, but more globally, and where there are very few policy levers for the international community, because these countries are not countries that receive large amounts of aid, for example. On the other hand, we have endemically fragile countries, for example, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Haiti, which are trapped in a cycle of extreme violence, poverty, and underdevelopment, and need a significant amount of support to exit fragility. In order to respond effectively to the challenge of fragility, it's important to take account of the role of emerging powers in fragile states, the approach that they take to fragility, and the type of engagement that they have in these contexts. Obviously, the most important is China. China is invested heavily in fragile states around the world, from Afghanistan to Sudan to South Sudan, and hence has a range of interests involved in these countries, although it takes generally a non-interference approach. On the other hand, you have countries such as Brazil and South Africa that are very engaged in multilateral responses to fragility, whether in their own regions, for example, South Africa in relation to the African Union, or at a global level. Finally, you have countries like India, for example, which are much more resistant to engaging with the international community on issues of fragility, particularly within their own neighbourhood. Addressing fragility has to be an important priority for the EU's external action, for a number of reasons. Firstly, increasingly fragile states are found in Europe's own neighbourhood and can pose a threat to Europe's own security and prosperity. Secondly, in terms of the global goods that Europe is trying to achieve at multilateral level, whether that's managing climate change, whether it's global security, whether it's norms and rules around financial and economic global management, those can't be achieved if a significant proportion of states are unable to manage their own affairs or unable to participate effectively in multilateral action. And finally, Europe is committed to supporting the people who are most in need, in terms of the people suffering most from poverty, from human rights violations and from violence. And many of those people are obviously living in fragile states.